On the frozen hills of Korea, soldiers from many nations stood shoulder to shoulder under the United Nations banner during the Korean War. The American military possessed enormous resources, powerful artillery, and advanced equipment. Yet on several difficult ridgelines, a smaller unit earned an unexpected reputation for discipline and battlefield effectiveness. The soldiers belonged to one of Canada's most respected regiments, the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. Allies quickly noticed something remarkable. Despite having fewer resources, these soldiers consistently held their ground, coordinated their defenses, and executed tactics with precision that surprised many observers. How did this regiment earn such respect on one of the most challenging battlefields of the 20th century? Before we continue this story, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and support our history community. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? Now, let's return to the rugged hills of Korea. When the Korean War began in 1950, it quickly became an international conflict. Under the command of the United Nations, soldiers from several countries joined the effort to defend South Korea from invasion. Among these forces were units from the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, and Canada. Canada sent several battalions to the Korean peninsula, including the experienced regiment known as Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, often referred to simply as the Patricias. The regiment had already built a long military tradition, dating back to the early 20th century. Its soldiers had served in difficult conditions during the World War I and later in the global conflict of World War II. By the time they arrived in Korea, the Patricias carried decades of combat experience within their ranks. But Korea presented an entirely different kind of battlefield. The terrain was steep and unforgiving. Hills rose sharply above narrow valleys, and the front lines often stretched across rugged ridgelines that were difficult to climb and even harder to defend. Weather made the situation worse. Winters in Korea were brutally cold. Temperatures dropped far below freezing, turning the ground into solid rock and making it nearly impossible to dig new trenches. Equipment froze, weapons required constant maintenance, and soldiers had to endure harsh winds while standing guard through long nights. Under these conditions, success depended on discipline, preparation, and careful coordination between units. American forces brought tremendous firepower to the battlefield. Artillery batteries, heavy machine guns, and air support provided powerful advantages during major engagements. But firepower alone could not guarantee control of the terrain. Many battles in Korea were decided by small groups of soldiers, defending narrow hilltops, trenches, and outposts that overlooked vital routes through the mountains. This was where the Patricias began to stand out. Their training emphasized cooperation within small infantry units. Soldiers learned to move carefully through rough terrain, support one another during defensive actions, and maintain strong communication even during chaotic firefights. Commanders encouraged flexibility and initiative. Instead of relying solely on heavy weapons, the regiment focused on positioning, observation, and disciplined use of infantry tactics. Patrols carefully studied the surrounding hills, identifying potential enemy approach routes and reinforcing the most vulnerable sections of the defensive line. One of the regiment's greatest strengths was its ability to hold ground under pressure. While artillery and aircraft could disrupt enemy forces from a distance, the final defense of a position always depended on the infantry soldiers standing inside the trenches. These soldiers had to react quickly to sudden attacks, coordinate rifle fire, and use grenades and machine guns effectively. When enemy patrols approached their positions, night after night, the Patricias maintained watch along their assigned sectors. Listening posts were placed down the slopes to detect approaching movement. Barbed wire obstacles were stretched across likely attack routes. Machine gun nests were carefully positioned to cover blind spots between trenches. Every detail mattered. Because on the Korean front lines, a single weak point could allow an enemy patrol to break through. Over time, neighboring Allied units began to notice how well the Canadian regiment managed its defensive positions. Reports described their trenches as organized and disciplined. Patrols were conducted regularly, and communication between squads remained clear even during difficult conditions. The soldiers themselves rarely spoke about these achievements. For them, the work was simply part of their duty. But as the war continued and the battles for the hills intensified, the reputation of the Patricias continued to grow. And soon, one particular engagement would show the world exactly why this regiment had earned such respect on the battlefield. By early 1951, the war along the Korean peninsula had entered a difficult and uncertain phase. The rapid advances and retreats of the first months had slowed, and the front lines began to stabilize along a chain of rugged hills and valleys. Control of these hills often determined which side could observe enemy movements and direct artillery fire. For the soldiers of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, this meant holding exposed positions where every ridge could become a battlefield. Many of these hills looked quiet during the day. Thin lines of trenches stretched across the slopes, reinforced with sandbags and timber. Barbed wire obstacles were placed below the ridgelines to slow approaching forces. From a distance, the position seemed almost peaceful. But as night approached, the situation changed completely. Darkness allowed patrols from both sides to move across the valleys and up the hillsides. Soldiers had to remain alert for the faint sounds of footsteps, the quiet movement of equipment, or the sudden flash of a signal light. In these moments, discipline mattered more than anything else. The Patricias trained their soldiers to operate in small teams, each member responsible for a specific task during defensive operations. Machine gunners covered narrow approaches to the trench line. Riflemen watched the wire obstacles below the hill. Grenadiers prepared to respond if enemy troops reached the outer perimeter. Every soldier understood that coordination could determine whether a defensive position held or fell. American forces operating nearby often possessed significant advantages in equipment. Artillery batteries could deliver powerful barrages when enemy formations were detected at distance. Aircraft sometimes provided additional support during large-scale engagements. However, artillery and aircraft were not always available during sudden nighttime clashes. In those moments, the battle belonged entirely to the infantry. And this was where the Canadian regiment's training made a difference. Patrols from the Patricias regularly moved beyond their defensive lines to observe enemy activity. These patrols gathered information about terrain features, possible approach routes, and signs of enemy preparation for attacks. The information they brought back allowed commanders to strengthen weak points in the defensive line. If a certain slope offered easy cover for approaching troops, machine guns were repositioned to watch that direction. If a valley allowed enemy soldiers to move unseen during darkness, additional listening posts were placed further forward. These careful preparations created layered defenses. The first warning of approaching movement often came from listening posts located downhill from the main trenches. Soldiers stationed there communicated quietly with the rest of the unit, allowing defenders to prepare before the attackers reached the wire obstacles. When enemy patrols attempted to move closer, the defenders responded quickly. Rifle fire illuminated the darkness. Machine guns swept narrow approach paths. Grenades were thrown toward areas where movement had been detected. These engagements were usually brief but intense, often lasting only minutes. They forced attackers to retreat down the slopes before reaching the trench line. Over time, Allied units began noticing how consistently the Patricias managed these encounters. Their defensive positions rarely collapsed under sudden pressure. Their patrols returned with valuable intelligence. Their trenches remained organized and well-maintained despite the harsh conditions. This reliability earned respect among neighboring units. American soldiers who fought alongside the Canadians observed their methods closely. Some commented on how effectively the regiment used terrain to strengthen its defenses. Rather than relying entirely on heavy firepower, the Canadians focused on positioning and timing. A well-placed machine gun could control a narrow ridge path. A properly positioned observation post could detect enemy movement long before it reached the trench line. These small advantages accumulated over time. They allowed relatively small groups of soldiers to defend positions that might otherwise require much larger forces. As weeks turned into months, the Patricias continued to hold their assigned sectors along the Korean front. Their reputation quietly spread across the battlefield. Commanders recognized that these soldiers were not simply relying on courage or luck. Their effectiveness came from training, preparation, and the ability to adapt their tactics to the difficult terrain of Korea. And soon, during one of the most intense battles of the war, the regiment would face a challenge that tested everything they had learned. The hills of Korea were about to erupt into one of the most dramatic engagements of the conflict, and the soldiers of Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry would prove exactly why their discipline and tactics had earned such widespread respect. As the months of the Korean War continued, the front lines hardened into a long chain of defensive positions across the mountains. Control of the hills became everything. A single ridge could provide observation over miles of terrain, allowing artillery to strike supply routes and troop movements. One of the most important defensive positions held by Canadian forces was a rugged elevation known as Battle of Kapyong. The surrounding valley served as a crucial approach route. If enemy forces captured the ridges overlooking it, they could advance deeper into Allied territory and threaten major supply lines. For this reason, holding the hills became an absolute priority. The soldiers of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry were assigned to defend a key section of the ridgeline. The position looked strong on a map, but on the ground, it presented serious challenges. The slopes were steep and uneven. Trees and rocks created shadows that could conceal movement during darkness. Narrow trails wound up the hillsides, offering possible paths for approaching forces. The Canadian soldiers spent days strengthening their defenses. Machine guns were placed to cover the most likely approach routes. Mortar teams prepared firing positions behind the main trenches. Communication lines were carefully organized so that every squad could receive orders quickly during an emergency. Despite these preparations, everyone understood that the coming battle would test the entire defense. Intelligence reports suggested that large enemy formations were moving through the region. Their objective was clear: break through the defensive lines and open a path through the valley. On the evening before the attack, the hills were unusually quiet. Cold winds moved through the trees, while soldiers checked their weapons and watched the dark slopes below. Listening posts reported faint movement far down the hillside, but nothing confirmed a major advance yet. Then, late in the night, the first signs appeared. Scattered rifle shots echoed across the valley. Flares briefly lit the sky, revealing movement along the lower slopes. Soon after, mortar shells began landing around the outer defenses. The battle had begun. Enemy forces attempted to climb the ridges under cover of darkness, hoping to overwhelm the defensive positions through numbers and momentum. But the Canadian defenders were ready. Machine guns opened fire along the narrow trails leading toward the trenches. Riflemen carefully aimed into the shadows where movement had been spotted. Mortar teams launched shells toward concentrations of troops further down the hillside. The steep terrain worked in the defenders' favor. Attackers had to move uphill while exposed to defensive fire. Every step forward required climbing through rocks, trees, and defensive obstacles placed earlier by the Canadians. The fighting continued through the night. Wave after wave attempted to push closer to the ridge, but the defensive coordination of the Patricias prevented a breakthrough. Communication between squads allowed them to shift firepower quickly to sections of the line under the greatest pressure. When one position faced heavy attack, neighboring squads reinforced it with additional rifle fire and grenades. Even as ammunition ran low in some sections, the defenders held their ground. Artillery support from Allied forces eventually joined the fight, targeting areas where enemy troops had gathered below the ridge. The explosions echoed across the mountains, slowing further advances. By morning, the hills were quiet again. The defenders remained in their trenches, exhausted but still in control of the ridge. Their disciplined defense had prevented the enemy from seizing the vital position. News of the battle quickly spread across Allied units. The stand made by the Canadian regiment demonstrated how well-trained infantry could hold critical ground even under overwhelming pressure. Their coordination, preparation, and use of terrain had turned a dangerous situation into a defensive success. For the soldiers themselves, the victory brought little celebration. They knew that the war was far from over. More battles would follow. More nights would be spent watching the dark hills below. But their actions had proven something important. In the harsh mountains of Korea, discipline and tactical skill could sometimes matter just as much as sheer firepower. And the reputation of the Patricias as one of the most dependable infantry units on the front lines continued to grow. After the fierce fighting in the mountains, the front lines of the Korean War slowly returned to a tense silence. The ridges that had erupted in gunfire only nights before now stood quiet again, covered with mist and the cold winds of the Korean hills. But beneath that silence was a growing realization among Allied commanders. The stand made by the soldiers of the Princess, Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, had done more than simply defend a hill. It had demonstrated how a disciplined infantry unit could hold critical terrain even when facing larger attacking forces. In modern warfare, much attention is often given to heavy equipment, artillery, aircraft, armored vehicles, and advanced weapons. These tools can shape the battlefield in powerful ways. Yet the battle in the Korean hills reminded everyone of an older truth. In the end, control of the battlefield still depends on soldiers standing their ground. The Canadians had relied not only on weapons but on preparation, coordination, and understanding of terrain. Their machine gun placements had been carefully chosen to control narrow approach routes. Their listening posts had provided early warning of enemy movement during the night. Most importantly, their small unit communication allowed them to react quickly when the pressure increased. When one section of the line came under heavy attack, nearby squads shifted their firepower to support them. Mortar teams adjusted their positions to strike enemy groups gathering below the ridge. These adjustments were not dramatic moments of heroism captured in headlines. They were quiet decisions made by experienced soldiers who understood how to work together under extreme pressure. After the battle, Allied officers studied the defense carefully. Reports circulated through command channels, describing how the Canadian regiment had managed its defensive positions. These reports highlighted something important. The success of the defense had not depended solely on overwhelming firepower. Instead, it had relied on discipline, training, and the intelligent use of terrain. American units operating nearby also took note. Cooperation between Allied forces improved as soldiers shared observations and techniques learned from their experiences on the hills. In many ways, the battlefield had become a classroom. Every engagement provided lessons about what worked and what did not. The soldiers fighting in Korea were constantly adapting their tactics to survive in a harsh and unpredictable environment. For the men of Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, the battle became part of a much larger story. Their regiment had already built a long military tradition before arriving in Korea, but the events on those cold ridges added another chapter to that history. The defense demonstrated that smaller, disciplined infantry formations could successfully resist larger assaults when they used terrain and teamwork effectively. Over time, the reputation of the Patricias continued to grow across the Allied front. Their reliability in difficult situations made them a trusted unit whenever critical positions needed to be held. Commanders knew that when these soldiers were assigned to a sector, the defenses would be organized carefully and maintained with determination. Of course, the soldiers themselves rarely spoke about reputation. For them, the war was a daily routine of patrols, observation posts, trench repairs, and long nights watching the hills. Victory on one ridge did not mean the fighting was finished. The conflict would continue for years, shifting between intense clashes and uneasy stalemates, while negotiations slowly moved forward. Yet moments like the defense of the ridgeline proved something lasting. They showed that courage on the battlefield is often quiet and steady rather than dramatic. It is found in the soldier who stays alert during a freezing night watch, in the machine gun crew that holds its position despite exhaustion, in the patrol that moves silently through darkness to gather information that might save lives the next day. The story of the Patricias in Korea is not just about firepower or weapons. It is about discipline, preparation, and the strength of soldiers who trusted each other under the most difficult conditions imaginable. And long after the guns of the Korean hills finally fell silent, the lessons from those battles continued to shape how soldiers understood the true meaning of holding the line.